The air in the university common room was thick with the smell of old books, cheap carpet cleaner, and the particular brand of arrogance that comes from too much philosophy debated on too little sleep. It was a Friday evening, and the usual crowd had gathered. A group of graduate students, their voices loud and confident, were clustered around a worn-out sofa, their kingdom defined by empty coffee cups and the glow of a flickering floor lamp. He held court at the center of it all, a PhD candidate in philosophy. He was known for his sharp tongue and a belief that the world was a puzzle he had mostly solved. His name was Leo, and he loved the sound of his own voice, the way it could slice through a conversation and redirect it to his own theories. Tonight, the topic was talent, or rather, the performance of it. How did one know if someone was truly gifted? His argument, delivered with sweeping gestures, was that real talent was never quiet. It announced itself. It demanded to be seen and heard. Think about it, Leo said, his eyes scanning the room to make sure everyone was listening. A great painter doesn't hide their canvases in the attic. A brilliant musician doesn't just hum in the shower. There's a performative aspect, and necessary. Loudness to genuine skill. Silence, in matters of art, is usually just emptiness. A few nods came from his circle. A literature student named Chloe, who secretly wrote poetry she showed to no one, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But she didn't speak up. In a worn armchair tucked beside a tall bookshelf, away from the main circle, she sat. Her name was Alara. She was a second-year researcher in molecular biology, and she came to this common room not for the debates, but for the quiet hum of human presence while she worked. It was a background noise that helped her focus. A thick textbook on cellular processes was open on her lap, but her eyes weren't on it. They were watching the group, observing them with the detached, curious air of a scientist studying an interesting colony of organisms. She had a calm face, with thoughtful eyes that seemed to absorb more than they revealed. She rarely spoke in these loud debates, a fact Leo had noted and, in his mind, filed under unremarkable. The common room's piano was a permanent fixture of gentle ridicule. It was an old upright, its dark wood scarred with generations of use, one of its front legs slightly shorter than the others, making it list to the side like a tired ship. The keys were yellowed, and a few of the ivory tops were missing, giving it a gap-toothed smile. It was universally considered out of tune, though few could actually tell. It was more of a piece of furniture, a landing spot for empty mugs and forgotten scarves, than an instrument. As Leo's lecture on performative talent wound down, a friend of his, emboldened by the cheap boxed wine they'd been sharing, wandered over to the piano. He plonked himself down and began to peck the melody to a popular TV show theme. His fingers clumsy, the rhythm non-existent, the notes clunked out, sour and jarring in the already noisy room. It was the perfect, comedic punctuation to Leo's point. Everyone laughed, not at the music, but with the joyful recognition of shared incompetence. See, the piano proved it. Anyone could make noise. But no real music lived here. Leo's gaze, following the laughter, swept the room and landed on Alara. She had looked up from her book at the sound of the piano, a faint, almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of her mouth. Not a wince, exactly, but a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or a private thought. In Leo's mind, that look was translated differently. He saw it as confusion, as the blank stare of someone who wouldn't know a chord from a cheese grater. Idea, cruel and sparkling, popped into his head. It was the perfect, living experiment to prove his theory. Here was silence. Here was a person who moved through the world without a whisper of artistic claim. What better way to demonstrate that his philosophy was grounded in observable truth? He stood up, drawing the room's attention back to him. The bad piano playing stopped. You see, Leo announced, gesturing broadly. Noise, just noise. Because true ability doesn't linger in the shadows. His eyes locked onto Alara. He wanted an example. And she, quiet and observant in her corner, seemed like the perfect subject. Her, he said, pointing directly at her. A few people followed his finger, their expressions shifting from amusement to mild curiosity. Alara slowly closed her textbook, marking her page with a finger. Leo reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He extracted a 20-pound note, crisp and green, and held it up between two fingers like a magician about to perform a trick. I'll make you a wager, he said, his voice loud, clear, and dripping with playful challenge. He was performing now, for his friends, for the room. I'll bet you this 20 pounds right here, that you can't even play chopsticks on that thing. He nodded toward the derelict piano. A new wave of laughter rippled through his friends. It wasn't mean-spirited, not exactly. It was the laughter of a shared joke, the anticipation of a harmless, silly spectacle. They expected her to laugh too, to shake her head and wave him off, confirming her place in the silent, unmusical majority. Elara didn't laugh. She looked from Leo's face, bright with confidence, to the money in his hand, and then to the old piano. The room grew quieter, sensing a shift. The expectation of a quick refusal was fading, replaced by suspense. What was she doing? Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, melodic, and carried easily in the quieted room. It had a weight to it that her usual silence had hidden. "A wager?" she asked. Just those two words, but they were calm, measured. They weren't the flustered response of someone put on the spot. Leo, encouraged, stepped closer. The 20-pound note became a prop in his hand. "Sure, a simple bet. Just go over there and prove me wrong. Play anything, a scale, a single nursery rhyme. I'm not asking for a concerto." He grinned, leaning into the role of the generous challenger. "Hell, just play one note properly, and I'll be impressed." He was upping the ante, making the challenge so absurdly simple that her refusal would be even more definitive proof of his point. His friends were grinning, phones subtly coming out, ready to capture the funny moment. Elara held his gaze for a long second. In her eyes, there was none of the anxiety he expected to see. There was something else, a kind of sad patience, like a teacher watching a student make a fundamental error they would soon have to correct. She glanced again at the piano, and for a fleeting moment, her eyes seemed to soften, as if looking at an old friend who had been publicly mocked. Then, very slowly, she nodded. It was a small, almost graceful movement. She placed her heavy biology textbook on the seat of the armchair, smoothed her trousers, and stood up. A murmur went through the room. She was actually doing it. The spectacle was on. Leo's smile widened in triumph. He had called her bluff, and she was walking right into it. He pictured her sitting at the piano, fingers splayed, poking at the keys to produce a chaotic, hilarious clatter. It would be the perfect end to the evening. He'd be the guy who'd had the guts to test his theory, and life, as it so often did, would prove him right. Elara walked across the threadbare carpet. The room was utterly silent now, the only sound the soft shuffle of her shoes. She didn't look at the expectant faces. Her focus was entirely on the old, listing piano. She didn't rush. When she reached it, she didn't sit down immediately. She paused, standing before it, and ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the scarred wooden top. A gesture so intimate and familiar that it made the first drop of doubt form in Leo's stomach. It wasn't the gesture of a stranger approaching a strange machine. It was the gesture of someone greeting something they knew. Then, she turned to face the keyboard. She still didn't sit. She just stood there, her posture straight but relaxed. She raised her right hand, not in a fist, not with a pointed finger, but with a gentle, curved shape, as if she was already holding something invisible. The theatricality of the moment was lost on no one. Leo felt his confident smile begin to feel stiff on his face. With a stillness that seemed to draw all the sound from the room, Elara extended her index finger. She didn't hover it uncertainly over the keys. She moved it with a quiet, unshakable certainty to a specific spot, the white key in the very center of the keyboard. And then, she played. It was not a poke. It was not a timid tap. It was a deliberate, controlled, and perfectly weighted press. Her finger descended with a pianist's touch, using the weight of her arm, not just the muscle of her finger. The note that rang out was middle C, but it wasn't just a sound. In that shabby, noisy common room, on that beaten-up, out-of-tune piano, that single note was a revelation. It was pure, clear, and resonant. It didn't asterisk plink asterisk or asterisk thud asterisk. It asterisk sang asterisk. It hung in the air, a perfect, round tone that seemed to vibrate in the chests of everyone listening. It cut through the last remnants of whispered anticipation, and left behind a silence deeper than before. In that one note, everything changed. Every assumption Leo had made about performance, about silence, about this quiet woman in the corner shattered. You don't produce a sound like that from a single key by accident. You don't command a room with one note if you are a stranger to the instrument. That single, beautiful, authoritative tone was the first sentence of a story no one in that room knew they were about to hear. Leo's triumphant grin vanished completely, replaced by a blank, dawning shock. He wasn't looking at a novice anymore. The note hung in the air, not fading so much as being absorbed by the stunned silence that followed it. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The philosopher, Leo, felt his face grow warm. That sound. It was wrong. It was all wrong. A single note from a complete beginner on a terrible piano should have been a weak, tinny asterisk plink asterisk. It should have been funny. This note had been a statement. It had weight. It had a kind of quiet confidence that filled the space and left no room for laughter. He saw her hand, still curved in that soft, professional shape, hovering over the key. She hadn't jerked it back. She had held it there for a fraction of a second after the note sounded, feeling the vibration through her finger, listening. It was a musician's gesture. A cold, sinking feeling started in his stomach. Elara lowered her hand. She turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder. Her expression was still calm, but there was a new light in her eyes now. It wasn't anger or gloating. It was focus. The kind of deep, quiet focus he'd only seen in great chess players about to make a decisive move, or in surgeons just before an incision. She wasn't looking at the audience anymore. She was in her own world, and she had just decided to let them in for a moment. Without a word, she turned back to the piano. She pulled out the worn, creaky stool and sat down. This alone was different. The friend who had played earlier had slumped onto it. Elara sat with a straight back, not stiff, but naturally poised. She adjusted the stool's distance from the keys with a quick, practiced movement. She placed her hands in her lap, fingers loosely curled, and took a slow, centering breath. The room was so quiet they could hear the faint rustle of her sweater. Then she lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. Her fingers found their positions not by hunting and pecking, but by memory. Like a typist's hands finding the home row, they rested there, a picture of potential energy. And then she began to play. It wasn't chopsticks. It wasn't a scale. It wasn't anything any of them had expected. A ripple of delicate, high notes floated into the air, soft as moonlight on water. The melody was hesitant at first, a questioning, beautiful pattern that climbed and then fell back. It was intricate and flowing, full of subtle shades of softness. The left hand joined in with deep, resonant chords that should have sounded muddy on the old piano, but under her hands, they were rich and clear, providing a foundation that made the high notes shimmer even more. It was Debussy's Claire de Lune, and she wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling its story. Leo felt his mouth go dry. He knew nothing about classical music, but he knew what skill sounded like. This was miles beyond skill. This was feeling, channeled through absolute control. He watched her hands. They moved over the yellowed keys with a fluid grace that seemed impossible. They weren't hammering. They were dancing, pressing, caressing, lifting. The loud section swelled with a power that made the old instrument tremble, and the quiet parts drew the entire room in, forcing them to lean forward to catch every whispered note. He glanced at his friends. Their faces were blank with shock. The phones that had been raised to capture a joke were now held limply, forgotten. Chloe, the literature student, had tears welling in her eyes, touched by a beauty she hadn't seen coming. The guy who had butchered the TV theme earlier looked at his own hands, as if he'd never seen them before. The music filled every corner of the common room. It transformed the space. The stained carpet, the flickering lamp, the smell of old coffee, it all fell away. For those few minutes, they were somewhere else. They were in the world she was painting with sound, a world of quiet reflection, of melancholy beauty, of something deeply private that was being shared, not performed. Leo's mind raced, a frantic scramble against the evidence of his own ears. Asterisk, maybe she just knows this one piece. Asterisk, he thought desperately. Asterisk, she memorized it, a party trick. Asterisk, but as the piece moved through its sections, the technical difficulty was undeniable. Her left hand crossed over her right in smooth, impossible-looking arcs. Her fingers stretched wide intervals with no apparent effort. The rhythm was complex, shifting like water, yet she held it perfectly, naturally. This was no party trick. This was yours. A decade or more. As the final, gentle chords faded into silence, the room didn't erupt into applause right away. There was a collective held breath, a moment of shared disorientation, as if they had all been woken from a beautiful dream. Then, the clapping started. It wasn't wild cheering. It was deep, respectful, almost reverent. People were shaking their heads in disbelief, looking at each other with wide eyes. Elara's hands came to rest back in her lap. She sat still for a moment, her head slightly bowed, coming back to herself, back to this room. Then she slowly turned on the stool to face them. Her eyes went straight to Leo. He was still standing where he had been, the 20-pound note dangling forgotten from his fingers. His face was pale. All his theories about performative talent, his arrogant certainty, lay in ruins around him. He had been so utterly, completely wrong. And worse, he had been rude. He had tried to make a spectacle of someone who carried this incredible, quiet world inside her, a friend of Alara's. A petite woman studying chemistry who had been reading in the opposite corner. Broke the tension. She walked over, shaking her head with a small, knowing smile. She spoke to the room, but her words were for Leo. "You just had to poke the bear, didn't you?" she said, her voice soft but clear. She put a hand on Alara's shoulder. She started playing when she was 4. Got into the Young Pianists program at the National Conservatory when she was 10. They said she had a professional career ahead of her if she wanted it. She let that sink in. A child prodigy. The words hung in the air, making Leo feel smaller and more foolish by the second. "Why biology?" someone whispered, unable to help themselves. Alara answered this herself, her voice still that same quiet, melodic tone. "I loved the piano. I still do. But I also loved questions. How things work. Why a cell does what it does. The music. It became something for me. Not for a stage." She looked at Leo again, not with anger, but with a piercing clarity. "Not for a wager," the chemist friend continued, filling in the gaps. "She teaches a few private students, pays her rent that way, but she doesn't really play in public. Not like this." Leo finally found his legs. He walked forward, the carpet feeling unsteady under his feet. The journey from his spot to the piano felt like a mile long. Every eye in the room was on him. He stopped in front of her. The 20-pound note felt dirty, stupid, in his hand. He held it out to her, unable to meet her eyes for more than a second. You win," he managed to say, the words thick in his throat. Alara looked at the money, then back up at his face. She didn't take it. "The money was never the point," she said. Her voice wasn't cold, but it was final. It was a teacher delivering the lesson after the demonstration. "You thought you could measure what's inside a person by how much noise they make on the outside. That's a poor way to navigate the world." She stood up from the piano bench. She didn't take the money. She simply left it there, on top of the scarred wood, next to a forgotten coffee mug. The gesture said everything. His bet, his money, his entire premise was irrelevant. Insultingly small, she walked back to her armchair, picked up her heavy biology textbook, and tucked it under her arm. She gave the room a small, general nod, not unfriendly, but distant. Then she walked out of the common room, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft click. The silence she left behind was different from the one before she played. That had been a silence of anticipation. This was a silence of aftermath, of processed shock. People slowly began to move, to murmur, to look at each other. The spell was broken, but the room was changed. Leo was left standing alone by the piano, the discarded banknote a monument to his mistake. He looked at the keys, still seeming to vibrate with the ghost of the music. He had wanted to prove that silence meant emptiness. Instead, he had learned that the deepest wells are often the stillest on the surface, and he had foolishly thrown a stone into one, only to be humbled by the profound, echoing depth he had disturbed. The quiet click of the common room door shutting behind her felt louder than any note she had played. Inside, the silence she left was thick and heavy, like the air after a thunderstorm. Leo stood frozen by the piano, the 20-pound note still pinched between his fingers. It felt like a piece of trash he'd forgotten to throw away. He slowly lowered his hand, crumpling the note into his palm, his knuckles white. He couldn't bring himself to look at his friends. He could feel their eyes on his back, a physical weight of judgment and pity. The triumphant showman from 20 minutes ago was gone, leaving behind a hollow, embarrassed shell. Someone, maybe the literature student who had been moved to tears, started a slow, sincere clap. A few others joined in, not for Leo, but for the music that still seemed to hang in the air. The sound was brief, awkward, and then died out. The normal Friday night noise did not return. The spell wasn't broken. It had just changed shape. The chemist, Alara's friend, gave Leo a long, unreadable look. She didn't say anything else. She simply gathered her own books and left, following the same path out the door. Her exit felt like a final punctuation mark on the whole humiliating episode. Slowly, the group began to disband. Conversations started up in hushed, serious tones. People spoke about the music, about the shock, about her skill. They didn't speak directly to Leo. He was an island in the middle of the room. He heard snippets, like a concert. And I had chills. And who just has that hidden? Every word was a small needle. Finally, he forced himself to move. He shoved the crumpled money deep into his pocket and walked, not to his friends, but straight out of the common room, his head down, The hallway outside was cool and empty. He leaned against the cold plaster wall, closing his eyes. His heart was pounding, not from excitement, but from a deep, shameful heat that spread from his chest to his face. He kept seeing her hands, the calm, certain way they had found the keys, the impossible fluency of their movement. He heard that single, perfect middle C ringing in his memory, the warning shot he had been too arrogant to heed. He had been so sure of his philosophy. Asterisk talent announces itself. Asterisk what a joke. He had confused loudness for substance and silence for emptiness. He had taken her observation for passivity. He had been, in every possible way, a fool for the next week. Leo moved through the university like a ghost. He was quiet in his seminars, offering none of his usual, opinionated contributions. He ate lunch alone. He avoided the common room entirely. The story, of course, had spread. It was too good not to. The philosopher who bet against the quiet biologist and lost spectacularly to a Debussy masterpiece. He caught people looking at him in the library, in the cafe, with little smiles or whispered comments. He wasn't a villain in the story, he realized. He was the punchline. His own thoughts were his worst company. He replayed the moment of the wager over and over. Why had he done it? To impress people who, he now saw, weren't really impressed by that kind of thing. To prove a point that was, at its heart, shallow and unkind. He had wanted to be the clever one, the one who could see the truth of people. Instead, he had revealed his own blindness. He thought about Alara. He saw her in the distance sometimes, walking across the quad with her biology bag, always alone with her thoughts. He never approached her. What could he possibly say? Sorry felt too small, too cheap. His apology was in the change he was slowly, painfully forcing upon himself. He started to listen more. In group discussions, he waited, letting others speak first. He paid attention to the quiet people, not to analyze them, but just to notice them. The girl who always drew intricate patterns in the margins of her notebook. The guy who fixed everyone's bikes but never talked about it. He began to understand that a whole universe of skill and passion existed in the silence he had once dismissed. About 10 days after the incident, he was in the library, deep in a dense text about moral philosophy. The words blurred on the page. He needed a break. Without thinking, his feet carried him on a familiar route, down the corridor that passed the common room. It was late, past 10, and the building was mostly empty. As he neared the door, he heard it. Music. It was faint, seeping through the closed door. It wasn't Claire de Lune. This was different. It was structured, mathematical, and incredibly fast. A cascade of precise, glittering notes tumbled over one another in a complex, joyful pattern. It was Bach, though Leo didn't know that. To him, it sounded like a clockwork universe made of sound, perfectly engineered and breathtakingly beautiful. He stopped, his breath catching. He knew who it was. There was no one else it could be. He should have walked away. He had no right to listen. This was her private world, the one he had so clumsily invaded. But he was rooted to the spot, captivated. This music was different from what she had played before. That had been a painting in sound, all emotion and moonlight. This was a feat of brilliant engineering, a demonstration of pure, disciplined mastery. It was, he realized, perhaps what she played when she was truly alone. For the sheer love of the puzzle, of the physical challenge, he didn't open the door. He just stood there in the dim hallway, leaning against the wall, and listened. The music flowed, stopped, then repeated a tricky section, her fingers working through a problem. He heard the focus, the dedication. This wasn't for an audience. This was a conversation between her and the music, and he was just a passerby eavesdropping on something sacred. After a while, the music shifted again. It slowed, becoming a sad, haunting melody that seemed to ask a question it knew had no answer. It was Chopin. The sorrow in it was so pure and private that Leo felt like an intruder all over again. This was too personal. He pushed himself away from the wall. As he turned to leave, the music stopped mid-phrase. A second later, he heard the soft sound of the piano lid being closed. Not a slam, but a gentle, final click. He walked quickly back to his dorm room, the echoes of the music trailing in his mind. He didn't feel jealous or even ashamed anymore. He felt a profound sense of respect and a new understanding. Her talent wasn't hidden because she was shy or insecure. It was guarded because it was precious. It was a part of her soul, not a tool for entertainment or a weapon for winning arguments. She had chosen a life of inquiry in a lab, but she had kept this other language, this other way of thinking and feeling, for herself, until he had forced her hand. That night, He took the crumpled 20-pound note from his jacket pocket. He smoothed it out on his desk. It was just paper, a symbol of a stupid bet, but it had also become a token, a reminder of the lesson. He didn't frame it or throw it away. He simply placed it inside the cover of his notebook, a bookmark separating the person he had been from the person he was trying to become. He saw her one last time before the term ended. It was at a campus coffee cart. They reached for the same sugar dispenser at the same time. Their hands didn't touch, but they both pulled back. "Sorry," he said, finally looking directly at her. His voice was quiet. She met his gaze. Her eyes were the same, calm, observant. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was an acknowledgement. She had seen the change in him, the new quietness. She took the sugar, stirred it into her coffee. "Good luck with your research," he said, the words feeling clumsy but sincere. "You too," she replied, "with your philosophy." There was no edge to her voice. It was a simple, neutral statement. She walked away, leaving him at the cart. He watched her go, a woman carrying worlds inside her of science, of music, of quiet certainty. He had wagered she couldn't play the piano, and he had lost much more than 20 pounds. He had lost a lazy assumption, and in its place, he had gained a difficult, valuable truth, that the most real things are often the ones that make the least noise, until someone is foolish enough, or lucky enough, to truly listen. And he knew, as he took his own coffee, that he would spend a long time learning how to listen better. The rest of the term unfolded under a different, quieter sky for Leo. The memory of that night was a stone in his shoe, a constant, uncomfortable reminder that kept him from walking too arrogantly. He no longer held court in the common room. Instead, he found a corner in the library's periodicals section, a place with less traffic and fewer echoes of his own past voice. He threw himself into his work, not with loud declarations, but with a determined silence. His thesis was on the philosophy of perception, how we see what we think we see. The irony wasn't lost on him. His personal experiment had yielded disastrous, enlightening results. He wrote long into the night, his arguments now laced with a new humility, considering the vast landscapes of knowledge and talent that exist outside of human acknowledgement. He started noticing things he had always filtered out before. The care with which the elderly library clerk sorted returned books, her fingers knowing each spine's place by touch, the intense, whispered debates between two astronomy postgrads over star charts in the cafe, a universe of complexity in their hushed tones. The world, he realized, was full of people speaking in languages he hadn't bothered to learn. Music was just one of them. He did not try to find her. He felt he had forfeited that right. But the university was a small world, and their paths crossed in quiet ways. He saw her through a lab window, peering intently into a microscope. Her posture the same as at the piano, focused, still, absorbed. He saw her leaving a lecture hall, deep in conversation with her chemistry friend, gesturing with hands that could build molecules or summon sonatas. She was a study in contained depth. One rainy Wednesday afternoon, he was in the biology wing, returning a borrowed book to a friend. As he rounded a corner, he almost walked straight into her. She was coming out of equipment room, holding a box of glass slides. They both stopped short. "Oh," he said, his voice oddly thick. "Hello," she replied. Her expression was neutral, polite, not friendly, not hostile. It was the way you might acknowledge a familiar piece of furniture. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of a distant vacuum pump and the patter of rain against the high windows. He knew he should just nod and walk on, but the weight of the unsaid felt heavier. I listen sometimes," he blurted out, then immediately winced. It sounded creepy, wrong. She tilted her head slightly, waiting, not on purpose. He rushed to clarify, his face warming. "I mean, when I'm walking late, past the common room, I hear you playing, sometimes." She didn't look surprised or angry. She adjusted her grip on the box. "It's a public space," she said. "The sound travels. It's different," he said, struggling for the words. "What you play then, it's not like what you played that night." A faint, almost ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No, Claire de Lune is for an audience, even an unexpected one. What I play for myself is maintenance, practice, thinking in another language, he repeated softly. The phrase resonated deeply. That's exactly what it was. It sounds more mathematical, sometimes sad. She studied him for a moment, as if reassessing a specimen under a new light. Bach is mathematical. Chopin is sad. You're listening more closely than you did before. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, but it felt like a small, hard-won prize. I have to, he admitted, looking down at his shoes. I was so sure I knew how to listen. I didn't know anything. Another silence, but softer now. The rain intensified, drumming against the glass. Why biology? He heard himself ask. It was the question everyone had wondered that night. When you had that, she shifted the box to her hip. The piano tells you what it's going to be. The notes are set. Your interpretation changes, but the framework is there. It's about feeling within a structure. She nodded toward the lab doors behind her. In there, the framework isn't written yet. You're trying to listen to something that doesn't have a language, a cell dividing, a protein folding. It's a quieter mystery. For me, it's a bigger one. He understood. He, who loved the loud, structured debates of philosophy, was finally understanding the allure of a silent question. She had chosen the ultimate quiet over the certain music. I'm sorry, he said finally. The words were simple, but they carried everything: the public wager, the arrogance, the reduction of her to a punchline. She accepted it with a slow nod. I know, she said. It's okay. But they both knew it wasn't fully okay, and it never would be. Some clumsiness can't be erased, only absorbed and learned from. Her okay meant she had seen his shame and his effort, and she was choosing not to hold it against him anymore. It was a gift of neutrality. Do you ever miss it? He asked. The performance part. The career you could have had? She thought about it. No, she said, and it sounded true. I play every day. It's in here. She tapped her temple. And in here. She briefly touched her chest. The career would have been about giving it away on a schedule. This way, it's a conversation I get to have for my whole life. It's mine. She looked at him, her gaze clear. You tried to take it for a joke, but you can't take it. It doesn't work like that. It was the clearest she had ever been with him. He had tried to take a piece of her inner world and make it a public spectacle, a currency for his own ego. He had failed because that world was sovereign. It issued its own passports. Thank you, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. For the lesson? For the music? For not making his life more miserable than it had been? She seemed to understand. She gave that small nod again. Good luck with your thesis, she said, and began to walk down the hall toward her lab weight. He called softly. She turned. The 20 pounds, he said. I still have it. It's in my notebook. I don't know what to do with it. For the first time, a real, though tiny, smile appeared on her face. It transformed her, making her look her age, just another student, amused by a oddity. Buy a coffee, she said. Listen to someone's story. Use it to learn something you don't already know. She paused. Or just keep it, to remember that a single note can change the tune of everything. Then she was gone, through the double doors and into the bright, sterile light of the laboratory. Leo stood in the dim hallway for a long time, listening to the rain and the hum of the building. The tight knot of shame that had lived in his chest for weeks began, slowly, to loosen. It wasn't gone, but it was changing shape. It was becoming part of his history, not his present. He didn't buy a coffee. That evening, he went to the common room. It was empty. The old piano sat in its corner, lid closed, a mute testament. He didn't touch it. He sat in the armchair she used to favor, the one by the bookshelf. He took out the 20-pound note, now worn soft from being folded and unfolded in his pocket. He smoothed it flat on the arm of the chair. Then he took out his phone. He found a recording of Debussy's Clair de Lune, performed by a famous pianist. He put in his earbuds and listened. It was beautiful, technically flawless. But as he closed his eyes, it wasn't the recording he heard. It was the slightly muffled, slightly tinny sound of the old upright. It was the creak of the stool. It was the collective, held breath of the room. It was the sight of her hands, moving with such certain grace, teaching him a lesson in perception more profound than any text. He opened his eyes. The note was just paper. The bet was just a stupid moment. But the echo of that first, perfect middle C, the sound of his own ignorance shattering, that would stay with him. He picked up the money, folded it neatly, and put it back in his notebook, not as a trophy of failure, but as a bookmark in the story of his own education. The most expensive and most valuable, 20 pounds he would never spend. Years have a way of softening the sharp edges of memory. The university, with its cramped corridors and intense, temporary passions, began to feel like a story Leo had read long ago, vivid but distant. He finished his doctorate, his thesis defended with a quiet competence that surprised his old, more theatrical self. He took a job not at a flashy institute, but at a small college, teaching philosophy to undergraduates who were more concerned with deadlines than dogma. He liked it. The questions were fresher, less burdened by ego. He married a graphic designer who saw the world in colors and shapes he couldn't perceive. She was quiet about her craft, often spending hours at her tablet, a slight frown of concentration on her face. He had learned, this time, not to mistake that silence for absence. He would bring her tea, place it silently beside her, and receive a smile that was a whole conversation. They had a daughter, who at the age of 5 became fascinated by the electric keyboard her grandmother bought her. The plastic thing played tinny demo songs and animal noises, but the child would press the keys with solemn concentration. One autumn evening, helping his daughter clean her room, Leo found the old notebook from his graduate studies tucked at the back of his own bookshelf. The cover was faded, the spine cracked. He opened it. There, pressed flat between the pages on the chapter about epistemic humility, the philosophy of knowing. What you don't know was the 20-pound note. It was fragile now, the creases white with age. He sat on the edge of his daughter's bed, holding it. The memory didn't flood back. It unfolded slowly, like a familiar piece of music. The common room, the arrogant challenge, the single, resonant note that had changed the air, the cascade of Debussy that had humbled him. He remembered the feel of the carpet under his feet as he walked the long walk to the piano, the heat in his face. He remembered her calm eyes. "What's that, Daddy?" his daughter asked, climbing up beside him. "An old lesson," he said, his voice soft. "Is it money? Can we get ice cream?" He smiled. "It's not for spending, sweetheart. It's a reminder of what? To listen," he said. "Really listen. Especially to the quiet things she didn't understand." But she nodded seriously, her small hand patting the note. "It's pretty old." Later that week, a chance encounter brought the past even closer. He was in the city for a conference, killing time in a large, bustling bookshop. As he browsed the science section, a name on a spine caught his eye. It was hers. She was the lead author of a specialized text on cellular signaling pathways. He pulled the heavy book from the shelf. The cover was sleek, professional. He flipped to the author photo. It was her, older, her hair shorter, her eyes behind stylish glasses, but the same calm, observant expression. Dr. Alara. He felt a strange pride, as if he had a tiny, shameful share in her success. He was about to put the book back when he noticed a small sticker on the shelf below. Author event today, 4 p.m. His heart gave a funny little jump. He hadn't seen or heard of her in over a decade. He checked his watch. It was 10 to 4. A part of him, the old part that would have overthought and made a grand decision, was quiet. The newer part simply walked towards the event space at the back of the shop. There were about 30 chairs set up, most of them filled with people who looked like academics and students. She was standing at a small podium, talking to the shop manager. She looked poised, intelligent, dressed in a simple blazer. She was not the quiet girl in the corner anymore. But she wasn't a performer either. She was an expert, sharing her work. He took a seat at the very back, partly hidden by a bookshelf. He didn't want to be seen. He just wanted to listen. She began her talk. Her voice was clearer now, more confident, but it still had that same measured, melodic quality. She spoke about communication at a microscopic level, about how cells send and receive signals in a language of chemistry. She used metaphors, calling one process a whisper and another a cascade. She talked about the beauty of silent, invisible dialogues that governed life itself. The audience was captivated. She was illuminating a hidden world. During the Q&A, a young man asked a technical question about noise in the signaling pathways. She considered it, then said, "It's interesting you used the word noise. In both my fields, distinguishing signal from noise is the fundamental task." Leo leaned forward. "My undergraduate degree was in music performance," she continued, a small smile playing on her lips. "Before I switched to biology. In music, you have the note, the pure signal, and you have the acoustics of the room, the imperfections of the instrument, the distractions in your own mind, the noise. The art is in producing and recognizing the true signal through all of that." She gestured to the cover of her book. "It's not so different in a cell. Our challenge is to hear the true chemical note through the biological noise of the system. The disciplines, they inform each other. They're both about listening for truth." No one in the audience knew the weight of that statement, but Leo felt it in his bones. She had taken the very thing he had tried to reduce to a party trick, and had built a life's philosophy with it. She had woven her two languages together into a single understanding of the world. He did not approach her after the talk. He watched her sign books, speaking kindly to each person. He saw the same patience, the same focus. He had learned his lesson long ago. Some conversations are complete in their silence. As he turned to leave, his hand brushed against a nearby display. It was a stack of children's books about famous composers. On top was a simple picture book about Debussy, with a grand piano on the cover. On impulse, he bought it. That night, back home, his daughter sat on his lap in her pajamas. He opened the book about Debussy. This is a story about a man who made music that sounded like moonlight. He began, like real moonlight? She asked, eyes wide. Like the feeling of moonlight, he said. He read her the simplified story, about impressions and sounds. At the end, there was a button that played a 30-second clip of Claire de Lune. He pressed it. The familiar, haunting melody tinkled out from the cheap speaker. His daughter listened, her head against his chest. It's sad and pretty, she whispered when it ended. Yes, Leo said, holding her close. It is. He thought of the old common room piano, the shocked faces, the weight of his own shame. He thought of the late-night Bach he'd overheard, a private engineering marvel. He thought of her in the bookshop, talking about signals and noise. He looked down at his daughter, who was now tracing the picture of the piano with her finger. Daddy, she said, can I learn to play for real? Not the animal sounds. He felt a lump form in his throat. Of course you can, he said, his voice rough. We'll find you a good teacher. Will it be hard? Yes, he said, kissing the top of her head. But the hard things are the ones that stay with you. The quiet things you learn for yourself. They become a part of you. No one can ever take them away. He didn't know if she understood. She snuggled deeper into his arms, already half asleep. The cheap children's book lay open on the bed, the tiny speaker silent now. But in his mind, as clear as if it were yesterday, he heard it again. Not the perfect recording from the book, not even the beautiful version she had played. He heard the first note. That single, stunning, middle C from the out-of-tune upright. The note that had contained a universe of skill and quiet history. The note that had stopped his world and started it again on a better, quieter path. The wager had been lost. The money was obsolete. The apology had been given. But the music, and the lesson it carried, remained. It was a signal, pure and clear, that had cut through a lifetime of noise. And finally, after all these years, he knew he was listening.